did you guys find that homework assignment on arguments and propositions and stuff like that? Fairly straightforward? A little Elijah gives me a so-so, but he wasn't here on Wednesday, so I feel, yeah, that would be challenging, right, if you didn't get the lesson. Somebody remind me, what's an argument? In this technical philosophical sense, did I mention that this is going to be the first question on your first exam? And your second exam? And like all the exams. This will be the first question on all the exams. And I guarantee there will be at least one person in the class that misses it every single time. What is it? Let's start with the new guy, Elijah.
Providing reasons for accepting
An argument provides reasons for accepting a statement. That's one way of doing it, yeah. Other options, there were some other, Cassie, you had your hand up, Lauren, you had your hand up, Omar, you had your hand up, Lauren?
An argument is an intellectual process.
It's an intellectual process. That's, yeah. Is that a definition? Or it's just a description, right? Like if I said, what's the definition of a fire engine? You said, fire engines are fast. I'd be like, that's maybe true, but I don't know if it's the definition of a fire engine. Kenneth? Connected series of statements to establish a definite proposition. Sometimes we call that connected series of statements. What do we call those? We call them premises. To establish a definite proposition, sometimes we call that the thing that's being established, the conclusion, the thing that's getting the support from the premises. Good, good. There's also some stuff about statements or propositions. These are interchangeable terms. And the difference between a proposition and a non-proposition. What's the difference? Yes. Amen. Say it one more time. Whether or not you can tell if it's true or false? It can be proven? If it can or cannot be proven. So God exists. Can that be proven? You could say that's true or false. That's what we're after. Is it the sort of thing that could be true or false? Whether or not we can prove it seems like a separate issue. There are plenty of propositions whose truth value is unknown, right? We would say, like, we're not sure if it's true or false. But those seem to be the two major options. Truth or falsity for the truth value of any proposition. And some sentences, some complete sentences just don't qualify. Questions don't qualify. Commands don't qualify. They don't even have a truth value. It's not that we can't tell what the truth value is. It's that they're not even the sort of thing that could be true or false. Okay. That was at our last meeting, and that was what our homework was about, and everybody seems to be relatively happy with it. Let's move on. Golly, that class is loud, right? It's not. Is it just me because I'm right next to the door? There's a teacher in there.
I have a question.
Yes.
You should make some coffee. That's a statement.
You should make some coffee is a statement. Because if I already made the coffee, I might say something like, that's false. I should not make some coffee because there's coffee already. You should is typically, and there's some debate about this, although
Words that
should, yeah, should, when you say you should do something, do you mean it in this, is it a command?
command, right? You should.
That's a suggestion maybe? Yeah, it's like to say that you should do something is slightly different than a command. There's actually like an interesting conversation in 20th century moral philosophy about moral judgments and what they are. Some folks say moral judgments are really just commands. Some people say, no, they're should statements. And this ends up being like part of a debate about whether or not moral judgments have any truth value. Those who say they're commands say that, like, no, they don't have truth value. They're not even the sort of thing that could. And those who say that they're what are known as prescriptive rather than descriptive statements. A description tells how the world is, sometimes how it was or will be. A prescription tells how things ought to be. It's like when your doctor gives you a prescription, it's usually like, you ought to take 2 of these and call me in the morning. So, yeah, statements about how the world ought to be are generally understood to be said as if they have a truth value. And then usually what we do is we have big arguments about what that truth value is and what sort of standards we're going to apply. But should statements or ought statements generally understood to be propositions or to be statements, right? Whereas commands, not so much. It's a subtle difference. It's an excellent question. Yes?
What about when you're saying should as a question? Like, should I do something? Like,
Well, if it's a question, then yeah. obviously. The questions are not going to have any truth value, right? They might have yes or no answers, but the question itself won't have a truth value. And somebody asked, I think at the end of class on Wednesday, what about rhetorical questions? And to the extent that rhetorical questions aren't really questions at all, but statements in the form of a question, like, are you going out like that, is maybe me trying to actually say you should not go out like that. If the question is earnest, then it doesn't have a truth value. If the question is a disguised rhetorical question that really is supposed to be a statement, and this depends on like how loosely we want to interpret language, right? This is the sort of thing that like two philosophers might actually have an argument about. Like somebody says, are you going to go out like that? And they're like, what's that all about? And then suddenly now it's a whole conversation of like, what did you mean? Is this a statement? Like blah, 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 blah. Okay. Today we're going to be working on something new, but my guess is you've seen it already because you had a reading assignment from Chapter 1. Only a small portion of Chapter 1 was on arguments and premises and conclusions. There was more, including a section on mapping arguments in a kind of like a visual, spatial sort of a way. We're going to be working on that today. It gives us some sense of what's going on in an argument, especially when the argument starts to get complicated. Because a lot of the examples that we've seen so far are really nice and straightforward. Usually it was just kind of like one premise, one conclusion, maybe two premises, three premises, and one conclusion. The sorts of arguments that you're going to encounter in conversation with people, the sorts of arguments you're going to encounter in the opinion section of the newspaper, who reads newspapers anymore? That you'll hear people talking about on cable news or like wherever it is that you're getting your information, wherever it is that you're hearing people make arguments. Natural language arguments that come from actual humans tend to be really, really complicated. Part of what we're trying to do in this class is to organize those arguments to make them a little bit more clear. And one of the things that becomes evident when we do organize arguments to make them a little bit more clear, what we might call reconstructing the argument, is that we get a sense of how the support structure between the premises and the conclusion is actually intended to work. We're going to start talking about that in a different sort of way at our next meeting, but today I want to give us a sense of like how it is that this support, get us thinking about the idea of a structure of support given by the premises to the conclusion, and the way that we can represent that in a drawing. So, as I said, real arguments are typically messier. They can be mixed up with all sorts of rhetorical devices and unrelated passages. Sometimes there are going to be things in a paragraph that we might read where the paragraph is making an argument, but not every single sentence, not even every single statement in the paragraph is actually part of the argument. So one of the things that we'll have to do is kind of discard things that we say this is irrelevant. It's not actually part of the argument. Another thing that we're going to have to do is recognize that sometimes I'll get a conclusion and somebody will be like, oh, I need a reason for that, and I'll give them a reason, and then they'll say something like, but why should I believe your reason? And so now I need to give a reason for my reason. And then they might say, well, why should I believe that reason? Now I need a reason for my reason for my reason for my conclusion. And conceivably, this could go on indefinitely, right? As anybody who's ever babysat a small child knows, you can get y chained to infinity, right? Or at least until you're tired. You're like, can we go outside and play? No. Why? Because it's raining. Why? Because water's falling from the sky. There's a whole Louis C.K. bit on this. And if the kid is actually being earnest, maybe they deserve an answer to their why question. Sometimes people do it just to be annoying. Sometimes they do it just for attention. Can we agree that in a friendly discussion between two people, if one of them asks for a reason, there should be some limit to how deep that why chain should go, right? At a certain point, you're going to be like, are you serious? Because a serious person, if I say, because it's raining outside, and they're like, why should I believe that? And you're like, because look out, there's water falling from the sky. And they're like, why should I believe that? And you're like, come on, man, you're just not, you're just fucking with me, right? This is not, serious. You don't seriously want to know why you should believe that water is falling from the sky. Only small children and philosophers ask questions like that. So, usually there's a point at which we cut off and we say, reasonable people involved in this conversation can all agree. We can start here, right? Okay, that gives us this, that gives us some other thing, that gives us some other thing. We call these complex arguments, where you have a single sentence that is functioning both as a conclusion of some other premise and also a premise for some later conclusion. Does that make sense? A single sentence could be both a conclusion and a premise within the same argument if it's a complex argument, where I need reasons to believe reasons to believe the conclusion. Okay. The way that I would map an argument is usually just by identifying the statements in the argument, numbering them, and then showing how the support flows. And the convention on this is that we draw an arrow that shows the support going from the premise to the conclusion. So in this argument, we have something like this. The legal prohibition ought therefore to be absolute, for those who think that torture would be advantageous to them will always be tempted to try to exploit any legal permission to use it. What's the conclusion of this argument? First of all, is this an argument? Is somebody giving reasons for something? Crickets. I thought you guys were good at identifying conclusions in arguments. Is this an argument?
Yeah,
Somebody's given a reason.
they're giving a reason for why torture should be permitted.
Yeah. The prohibition of torture ought, therefore, to be absolute, right? There should be an absolute prohibition on torture. That's my conclusion. And then statement 2 gives me a reason for thinking that. Why should it be absolute? Because if we leave any kind of legal wiggle room, right, if we say that there are some cases in which it's permitted, those who think that torture would be advantageous to them will always be tempted to try to exploit those loopholes. That's a reason for why we should make the prohibition on torture absolute. Does it completely win the day? No, but it's a reason, for sure, right? It's somebody who's trying to give some support to this idea. And the way that I represent this in my argument map is statement 2 supports 1. I show the arrow going from 2 to 1. Pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward. This is as simple as it gets. Here's the slightly more one slightly more complicated version of it. And this is that version that I was just talking about, where I need a reason for a reason for a reason for a conclusion. Here's a natural language argument, and let's see if we can follow that structure in the map to the right. The selling of human organs, such as hearts, kidneys, and corneas, should be outlawed. Allowing organs to be sold will invariably lead to a situation in which only the rich will be able to afford transplants. This is because whenever something scarce is bought and sold as a commodity, the price always goes up. The law of supply and demand requires it. What's the conclusion? Selling of organs such as heart, blah, 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 should be outlawed, right? There's a big fat hint because I had 1 at the bottom of my map. But if you didn't see that map, could you have figured that out? Okay, good. So there's my conclusion. Does 2 give me a reason to believe that the selling of organs should be outlawed? Allowing organs to be sold will invariably lead to a situation in which only the rich will be able to afford transplants. If I said 1 and you were like, really? And then I gave you 2, would you be like, oh, okay, I get why you would think that. All right, so 2 supports 1. What if you didn't believe this, though? What if you were like, really? Allowing organs to be sold will lead to a situation in which only the rich are able to afford transplants? 3 says, this is because, there's a nice little syntactical marker for us as well. This is because, what's the this? Yeah, everything in statement 2, right? Statement 2 is because we've kind of like telegraphed pretty clearly that 3 is a reason for 2 with this lead in. This is because whenever something scarce is bought up and sold as a commodity, the price always goes up. And 4 gives me another reason to believe 3. So 1's my conclusion. It's supported by 2. If you didn't believe 2, 3 supports it. If you didn't believe 3, 4 supports it. So as long as you believe 4, that'll get you to 3, which will get you to 2, which will get you to 1. Or at least give you reasons to move from premise to conclusion. Also pretty straightforward. Questions about this strategy for mapping? Okay, here's another strategy. What happened there? That's where I wanted to go. Okay. Sometimes the premises aren't supporting each other. It's not like, here's a conclusion with a reason, and now I need another reason to support the first reason, and now I need another reason to support that reason. It's not so much that all the reasons are supporting each other and in a chain like that. Sometimes they're each trying to support the conclusion, and they're doing it independently of one another. So for example, let's look at an argument like this. Smoking is a terrible habit. It makes one's clothes and breath smell bad. It is expensive. And it's a major factor in increasing all sorts of potentially fatal conditions, from heart failure to emphysema and lung cancer. My conclusion? Smoking is a terrible habit. It makes one's clothes and breath smell bad. Is that a reason, all by itself, for why smoking is a terrible habit? It's maybe not enough to completely tip the scales, but it's enough to like move the scales a little bit, right? I'm kind of like, all right. And then I go on to say, it's expensive. Does it's expensive get me to believe that it makes my clothes and breath smell bad?
No.
But is it another independent reason for why I might think smoking's a bad habit? Yeah. And what about it's a major factor in increasing all sorts of potentially fatal conditions? Does that get me to believe that it makes my breath and clothes smell bad? Does that get me to believe that it's expensive? Not really, although those, they could be linked. Yeah, for sure. All right, which like remind me to comment on that in just a second. But it seems like it could also be independent, regardless of the expense of these diseases. They're potentially fatal. Yeah. If you have a potentially fatal disease, my guess is your biggest concern is its fatality and not its expensiveness. Although, I don't know. Healthcare these days, who knows, right? So what we end up having here is 2 and 3 and 4 are all supporting my conclusion 1, and they're doing it independently of one another, such that if I took 3 and 4 away, 2 would still be a reason. I have this reason. 3 would still be a reason without 2 and 4. 4 would still be a reason without 2 and 3. And somehow all of them together get kind of like it makes the argument progressively stronger, right? As I keep giving you more reasons to think that smoking is a bad habit, it becomes more and more convincing, bit by bit, right? I'm stepping one step at a time towards feeling more and more convinced that smoking is a bad habit, the more independent reasons for considering that conclusion I get. The more of these I have, presumably the stronger the argument will be, but it's not like if I don't have them all, the argument is not an argument at all, right? It's just a little bit weaker each time I take one of those reasons away. Yep.
Almost visually, this is like whenever somebody's making an argument and they've stated their conclusion, but then they start going once because of this.
Yep.
This.
Yeah. Bless those people because they make it really easy to understand what they're saying, right? Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it's a weird way of talking. I don't know. A lot of academics have been like socialized or habituated to answer questions that way, or even to ask questions that way, right? To say like, my response has 3 parts. The first part is this, the second part is this, the third part is this. Here I go. This is also how a lot of you are instructed to write papers, and it's not just for yucks. It's because it's an incredibly well-organized way to make your point clear. All right, so that's this style. We also could have this style. See if you can spot the difference between this argument and the one that we just had about smoking. If President Obama was born in Massachusetts, then he's a native of New England. Obama is not a native of New England, therefore he was not born in Massachusetts. What's my conclusion? He's not born in Massachusetts. If President Obama was born in Massachusetts, then he's a native of New England. Does that tell me that he was not born in Massachusetts? Just statement 1 all on its own. Does that function as a reason at all? Like not even a weak reason, right? Yeah. But when I combine it with statement 2, Obama is not a native of New England, suddenly something clicks. Kind of the same way that I would say something like, Colorado is in the United States. United States is in the Western Hemisphere, therefore Colorado is in the Western Hemisphere. That first statement links Colorado to the United States. The second statement links the United States to the Western Hemisphere. My conclusion links Colorado to the Western Hemisphere. And I can't get that conclusion unless those 2 premises are both there working together. This is a very different structure of support than this one where all of the premises are independent. Here we'll say something like they're all jointly necessary to function as a reason. And we've got something like this going on here. 3 is my conclusion. He's not born in Massachusetts. Why do I believe that? Because he was not a native of New England, and if he was born in Massachusetts, then he is a native of New England. And that's actually a complicated inference that we'll learn about relatively soon, but it works. In fact, it works every time. If I say, if A, then B, and then I tell you not B, I can conclude not A. Do we get why this is different than this? Than this? The difference between those? And to indicate that in my diagram, I'll use... The convention that I'll be using is a brace. I think that's what we call this, a brace. Not a bracket, a brace. Or sometimes people call it an upside-down mustache, which I like too. So yeah, upside-down mustache tells me 1 and 2 jointly give me a reason for 3, but not independently. If they're independent, I'll represent it with separate arrows. Questions? Quest? It's just how you're sitting with your hand? Okay. Sometimes I can get multiple conclusions from the same premise. I can give one premise and then say, like, here's one conclusion we can draw from it, and also here's another conclusion we would draw from it. I'll represent that, again, with a brace, but then an arrow showing that the support is going from 1 to 2 and 3. In every study, time and time again, poverty is shown to be the most reliable stumbling block to future academic success. Thus, if we are seeking to improve education in this country, we need to address poverty first. Furthermore, and furthermore is usually a nice linguistic clue that, like, here's another different conclusion. Furthermore, our educational policies need to be sensitive to socioeconomic factors that affect student success. This is a weird sort of scenario that you might encounter. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of homework or quiz or exam questions about this. Mostly, I want you to be able to handle a complicated argument. As soon as like this pops up, sometimes there are like gasps, and people are like, ah, shit. That, like, yeah, I do expect that you should be able to do something like this, but this is kind of like about as complicated as it's going to get in this class. Real life arguments are incredibly complicated like this. This is a paragraph taken from an op-ed that I found. I don't even remember what the source was. Here, I'll read through it, the whole thing. Be on the lookout for what the conclusion is, and then from there maybe we'll see if we can get a sense of how to map this. I've got a sample map here. Oh, I almost forgot. There was this question about, what was it on the last one? Whether or not the potentially fatal conditions are also an expense. This reveals something that's probably important to mention. I think folks get anxious, especially when there are assignments about this sort of thing. There are multiple ways of reliably mapping any natural language argument. And this is hinging somewhat on the kind of flexible nature of the interpretation of somebody's language, right? Somebody makes a big, long paragraph. There's going to be more than one way to interpret it. When possible, we want to get the author to pin it down so that there's not a whole lot of ambiguity about what they mean. But when we don't have that author present and we can't pin it down, then sometimes we'll recognize that there is more than one way to map an argument. That doesn't mean that it, like, anything goes, though, right? Because like there are going to be some maps that will say, like, clearly that doesn't represent that argument very well. And when I give you homework questions and quiz questions and exam questions that are multiple choice questions, I'll do my best to make it so that none of the distractor answers are even plausible. So, let's look at this argument that we've got here. It's been widely acknowledged that the quality of undergraduate education in this country is diminishing. An often unrecognized cause of this malady is the exploitative way that universities treat their contingent faculty members. In many universities, there are no formal guidelines for evaluating the work of these instructors. As a result, poor instructors who are well liked by the department chairperson are often retained over better ones who are not. Another factor is the low pay given to these instructors. In order to survive, many of them must accept heavy teaching loads spread out over 3 or 4 institutions. The quality of instruction can only suffer when faculty stretch themselves too thin. Lastly, because contingent faculty rarely have a voice in administrative matters, their shoddy work conditions are never brought to light. What's the conclusion of this? The quality of undergraduate education in this country is diminishing. Statement 1. Is all the rest of this getting me to believe that the quality of undergraduate education is diminishing? So, and let's think about, like, because statement 2 is an often unrecognized cause of this malady is the exploitative way the universities. It's plausible that 1 gets the table set, but 2 really gives me the conclusion, right? It says, like, people have been talking about this an awful lot. What they usually don't talk about is this. The rest of this seems to be supporting that a cause of this malady is the exploitative way in which universities treat their contingent faculty members. So slightly different. This is one where I would be tempted to say 1 is just not really part of the argument. It's a reasonable part of this paragraph. Does a nice kind of rhetorical trick of introducing me to the general topic before jumping in and telling me what my conclusion is. 2 strikes me as a plausible conclusion with everything else supporting that somehow. And what I see from this map is a way of kind of organizing this. It looks like I've got 3 major branches to this argument, 3 and 4 working together with 3 supporting 4. Let's see if that works. In many universities, there are no formal guidelines for evaluating the work of these instructors, and as a result, poor instructors who are well liked by the department chairperson are often retained over better ones who are not. poor instructors being retained over better ones who are not, does that get me to believe that a cause of the malady of like the slipping of standards in undergraduate education is the way that contingent faculty members are treated? Yeah, seems like. And if I wasn't sure if that happened, then we would note that in many universities there are no formal guidelines for evaluating the sort of work that contingent faculty do. The standards are for other sorts of evaluations, right? So if we don't have those reliable standards, or if you stretch faculty too thin, both of those together get me to my conclusion 5, which supports my conclusion 2, right? All right. And then lastly, because 8, then 9, and 9 is a reason for my conclusion as well. So 3 distinct branches to this argument, and this gives me a sense of, like, if I disagreed with this conclusion, how I would attack this, right? Or how attack, that's so aggressive, but how I would try to address it. I would look and say, like, there are 3 distinct branches to this argument. I'll focus on this one, then I'll focus on this one, then I'll focus on this one. And it also lets me know that just because if there's something flawed in this branch that says 3 supporting 4 supports 2, if I'm like, actually, that's not true, have I undone the whole argument? No, we still got 2 more independent branches that are still standing. Maybe it weakens the argument a little bit. And have you ever encountered this in discussions or in disputes? One person says one thing, some person says another thing. If one of the parties manages to kind of undermine one point that the other party is making, do they sometimes do like a little victory lap, like, oh, I won the argument because I proved you wrong about something? But that doesn't necessarily work, right? If the argument is a complex one with many independent branches, cutting one leg off doesn't necessarily mean that the whole thing falls. There might be other pillars of support there. Okay. Questions about how to, yes, Cassie.
Okay, so just because something's labeled in the paragraph doesn't mean it makes it on the chart?
That's right. Just because it got a number doesn't mean that number makes it into the argument.
Okay, so number 1, it gave the overview, but 2 is there because it gave the detail?
Not because it gave a detail, but more along the lines of it seems that everything else in this paragraph is aimed at supporting 2.
Yeah,
It's possible that maybe 2 is aimed at supporting 1.
but that doesn't mean it's on that.
Well, we would just have another arrow from 2 to 1. I left it off because I don't think that it seems like 2 is supporting 1.
Yeah, like I get why, I just like, if we ever have an example of this on a test or anything, I don't want to put like the wrong thing.
Yeah, I don't want you to either. Yeah, be thinking, and one of this, it might actually be the sort of thing that reveals itself as you try to map it. If you wanted 1 to be the conclusion, you might suddenly find yourself like puzzled as to how it is that any of this provides support to 1. And if you find yourself in that situation where you're just like, it seems like nothing is providing support, one of the possibilities that should be coming to mind is like, maybe that wasn't the conclusion.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
In theory, though, like if it was another scenario, 1 and 2 could both be conclusion, and then we could draw all the premises from the rest of them. Like, you could have 2 conclusions, right?
I could draw, this was like, this version, I could draw 2 separate independent conclusions from the same premise.
But if it was a more complex argument, then
We could do this as well, yeah. We could have like all of this going and then to an upside down, or actually be a right side up mustache in that case, right? We'd do a brace, and then below it we'd put the multiple conclusions that we could draw from all of this. That's how I'd do it, yep. Any other questions?
And the brace means that 6 and 7 are supporting 5.
Yeah, and it means that they're supporting them in a jointly necessary way. That if 6 and 7 aren't both there, 5 doesn't get any support. 6 doesn't do it all by itself. 7 doesn't do it all by itself. This is why they don't each get independent arrows, like an arrow from 6 to 5 and an arrow from 7 to 5. What I'm saying here with this brace is 6 and 7 together give me a reason, but only if they come together. How you feeling? Want to do worksheet? Let's do worksheet.